Today we will speak about Goethe. With him we begin our 19th century literature course. He was born in the mid-1700s, but he's highly influential for the 19th century. As Nietzsche said of him, he's not a great man. Goethe is a culture. He's a culture. So, looking at Goethe, we see a very, very big picture of German culture. And let me just move forward to his legacy. There's only one other figure that can rival with Goethe's influence in German culture. Who would that be? Who has shaped German culture as much or even more than Goethe?
Martin Luther.
Exactly, Martin Luther. No one has shaped German culture more than Goethe and Martin Luther. Yes. And of course, they have shaped culture, but along with culture, they have also shaped language. The first translation actually it's not the first translation. But the point is, they both shaped language and they both influenced German culture. So if there's a figure that can rival or stand above Goethe, that would be Martin Luther. But when we focus on the 19th century, no other figure was as influential as he. In Goethe, we see what I would call a prophet. That's what I say, okay? So don't go around saying that he made prophecies, but I do see many of his prophecies being fulfilled in the 19th century. What is the main prophecy of Goethe? What you already have in the anthology of The Sorrows of Young Werther. Why? Who can tell me why? How can you see this as a prophecy? First of all, how many of you have read The Sorrows of Young Werther? Okay, quite a few of you. Good. Those of you who haven't finished them, please complete it by next session, okay? Because next session is going to be dedicated to focusing on The Sorrows of Young Werther. So, who can tell me why The Sorrows of Young Werther would be a prophecy?
He depicts a really clear romanticism that will take place in the whole world.
That's a very good point. And at the same time, it's a very debatable point. So some will claim that Goethe is a romantic, but it's not cut and dry. It's a little more, there are many more nuances to it. And some will radically defend that he was not a romantic, that he was a proponent of the Weimar classicism, or you have it on the board, Weimar classicism, or one of the great proponents of Sturm und Drang, which means storm and impetus in German. But regardless of how you envision Goethe, if you envision him as a proponent of Weimar classicism, if you envision him as the greatest figure of Sturm und Drang, if you envision him as a pre-romantic or even as a romantic, the point is that in Goethe we have a transition. We have one of those great figures that stand between two worlds. In him, of course, we see a strong influence, and he is someone who inherits classicism. Remember what we saw in the previous semester? Well, we didn't see it that much because we dedicated most of our attention to the Baroque. But after the Baroque, we had Neoclassicism, and the one author that you had to study of Neoclassicism was Jonathan Swift. And along with classicism, in political movements, there's the illustration and the illuminism. And Goethe partakes in this illumination in this 18th century, which is called in the 18th century is called the century of lights. So he partakes in that deeply. However, he also creates something new. You can say that he takes the blocks from the neoclassical period and he begins creating something new with those blocks, of course, but it's a new structure. I don't know if I am making this clear. To make it even clearer, you cannot understand Goethe if you do not know classicism. If you disregard the influence, especially of the Greeks, in Goethe, you will be puzzled and bewildered, and you will not know where this is coming from. The references, especially to Homer, that you find in the Sorrows of young Werther are way too many to be disregarded. So definitely he inherits a classical tradition, but he processes that tradition and creates something new. Let me clarify a little more why I think he became a prophet. With the Sorrows of young Werther, for the first time, we find nature not as a mere setting, but as a character. Nature takes an active role in the Sorrows of young Werther. Experiencing the course of seasons, that is something very distinct in the northern regions of the hemisphere, of course, that influences his feelings. So nature becomes an active agent in the Sorrows of young Werther. He pays attention to nature not only as the setting, but as a character with whom Werther exchanges his communications. He pays attention to children, to peasants, and to many other things that you could say were disregarded during classicism. And above all, he pays attention to his feelings. That quest for harmony and balance during neoclassicism had to some extent rendered neoclassicism cold and detached. You could even say passionless. Of course, that's a categorization. It's not completely fair to say that in Joseph Haydn there's no passion. But definitely when you compare Joseph Haydn with Beethoven, you see there's way more passion in Beethoven. And by the way, in Beethoven, we also have a figure of transition. If you consider the early production of Beethoven, he falls completely within the molds of classicism. Instead, if you consider the later production of Beethoven, especially after the Third Symphony, something new has come. And those are not my words. Those are Joseph Haydn's words, who was already very old, but got to listen to the Third Symphony of Beethoven, and he realized that something new had begun. We pay attention to nature, we pay attention to feelings. His character is that individual of Illuminism. Illuminism starts paying attention to the individual, right? So now, I'm not saying that before that they didn't pay attention to the individual, but the point is they exalt the individual. And they exalt the individual to the point where it becomes the center of history, and it becomes the center of Goethe's stories. Werther is an individual, and that's something new. Of course, you can always find predecessors, and you can say, well, what about Catullus? What about Ovid? Didn't they speak about themselves? Of course, they spoke about themselves, but tell me how many years, how many centuries had elapsed before them and Goethe. how long did we have to wait for someone to start speaking about himself, especially speaking himself in such a profound and such an intimate way as Werther did? And that's one of the innovations that made him very, very successful. Yes, did you have a question?
Is Illuminism the same as the Enlightenment?
Is exactly the same, yes. Illuminism and the Enlightenment are, and the Age of Light, it's all the same. Yes, it's all the same. And those are the predecessors of the French Revolution. In addition, you see in Werther someone who pays attention to the self-made man as opposed to novelty. From the outset, Werther knows that his love for Charlotte is impossible. Not only because she's engaged, and that's a major barrier that he should have considered from the outset, but leaving that aside, the social strata, the differences between them were way too many to be overcome, at least according to the convention of the time. And Goethe himself experienced in his own flesh that conflict. In his first love with Schoenköpf, that was her name, her last name, from the outset, it was very clear that this was an impossible relationship because of the difference of classes. So on the one hand, we have novelty. On the other hand, we have the bourgeois, who are self-made classes. Of course, they have money, but that doesn't mean that they have the novelty. So that creates a lot of conflict in society. And to make it even more explicit, you can see a very clear turn of events in the Sorrows of young Werther as you read along. Because you can see that the first half, or a little less than the first half, before say that the first 2/5 of the work are dedicated to contemplating beauty and nature. So everything is luminous. Everything is joyful. That resembles very much the first phase of Romanticism that we find very well embodied in John Keats. Someone who dedicates his entire life to worshiping beauty and nature and poetry and art. And that seemed like a very beautiful ideal, right? How the tables turn. You see in the final part of the Sorrows of young Werther how that worship for nature, that entronization of beauty and of those romantic ideals becomes adverse. Nature is against us. Beauty fades. The chestnut Werther found so inspiring has been chopped down. The child with whom he found a particular resonance has died. So while in the first half of the Sorrows of young Werther, everything speaks eloquently about beauty and about the benignity of nature, in the second half, we find that nature has become adverse against us. And you will see that clearly reflected in what has been called dark romanticism. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Edgar Allan Poe, Giacomo Leopardi in Italy, to some significant extent also Becker in Spain. So we have this second phase of Romanticism, And you can see how it was already prophesied in the Sorrows of Young Werther. If you want to push it a little more, what happens after Werther dies? Is that the end? No, it's not the end. It's not the end. Who collects the pieces and puts them together? His friend Wilhelm. Don't you think that would correspond to the late 19th century with realism? So there's this pattern. Of course, it's a template, and you should not fall within some kind of schematism. But nevertheless, you can see how Werther was so influential for the 19th century. That's why I call him a prophet. Of course, his prophecies were self-fulfilling prophecies. But what he penned down in the Sorrows of Young Werther would set a course for the entire 19th century. That is why he's so important for the 1800s. And that is why we begin this 19th century literature course with Goethe, who lived most of his life within the 1700s, but he sets a course for the entire 19th century. Any questions thus far? Okay. We know very little about Shakespeare, right? We know very little about Shakespeare. Of Goethe, we know everything. We know practically everything. There's hardly a shadow for the modern reader or for the modern scholar who wants to delve into the life and work of Goethe. Think of it. He became a celebrity in his early 20s. So he had plenty of admirers and biographers who wrote down practically every single detail of his life. And today he went to this other house of his other friend and he ate rice. They wrote every minute detail. Not only that, his collected works add up 148 volumes. 148 volumes. So if you are going to go and talk to the Dean of Studies and tell him, I have a good idea, why don't we get the collected works of Goethe? Okay, we will need another building for the library. 148, okay, it's an exaggeration, but 148 volumes. 148 volumes. That is the entire, those are the, that's the opera omnia of Goethe. Within those volumes, we have 12,000 letters written by him. Not everything is preserved, but most of his letters have been preserved. A good deal of his letters have been preserved. In addition, we have like 20,000 letters addressed to him. Even from the time when he was a child, his father kept invoices of all the expenses he made. So we can get a very accurate idea of how his childhood looked like from, well, his father bought this toy or his father paid this tutor for his education. We can have a very, very accurate idea. Not only that, he also was quite accomplished. He was quite accomplished in drawing. And besides literature, his other passion was drawing. And until today, like 3,000 of his drawings are still preserved. He draws also about his everyday life. So there's quite a lot for any scholar who wants to delve into the life and the work of Goethe. We know practically everything about him. If you want to find gaps and you say, no, we don't know everything, okay, sure, yes. What can go unnoticed? His earliest poems to Schenkopf. He burned most of those poems. Some of them are kept just by chance. But those poems have been, well, he destroyed them himself. Because when he got to Leipzig from Frankfurt, they made fun of him because his accent first was too strong, his indumentary was too provincial for the Leipzig standards, and especially his poetry was too baroque for what they were expecting. So for the first time, a 16-year-old Goethe finds himself being criticized. We'll get there, but it's quite understandable why he destroyed his early poetry. But say, that was before he was 16. So practically everything he wrote after he was 16 is still preserved to our days. So there's a lot of material for anyone who wants to look into his life, to do some further research. He was born in Frankfurt. Even in our days, that's a great city for connections, right? It's a great city for connections today, and it was the same back then. Remember, actually, to a significant extent, you could even say that it was even more back then, because Germany didn't exist as a nation, as a unified nation. You can say it existed as a concept, you can say it existed as a culture, but besides Prussia, and you cannot include Austria, but leaving aside Prussia, all that we understand as Germany today was divided in very minute cities, independent of themselves. Although it was named an empire, the authority of the emperor was very scarce. So most cities were autonomous and they ruled themselves according to the models of the era, which is absolute monarchy or illustrated despotism. So each little city was like a monarchy. So Frankfurt was a focal point for communications among several cities, and also for Great Britain, maybe France, the Netherlands, which meant that was also important not only for merchandise, but also for the bank. You needed a reliable and a trustworthy bank, and that made Frankfurt flourish as a city. He was son of the imperial counselor. So his father had the title of imperial counselor. And by the way, he had the title and only the title, which means he was completely unencumbered from any duties. He didn't have anything to do. That's why he dedicated himself to leisure and some weird activities like growing silkworms in his basement. He didn't have anything to do. But that doesn't mean he was a negligent person. On the contrary, he invested a lot of time and a lot of money and resources in the education of Goethe and of his sister Cornelia. So they received a very high education from very renowned tutors in that era, to the point that in his childhood, Goethe was already fluent in German, of course his mother language, but in addition he was also fluent in English, in French, in Italian, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Goethe was 6 in 1755. Anybody can tell me what, of course many things happened in 1755, but what could be the most remarkable thing in 1755? The Lisbon earthquake. A natural catastrophe, probably the most destructive earthquake in recorded history, where the death toll is estimated of something between 30 and 100,000 people. Because it was not only the earthquake, after the earthquake there came a tsunami and the wave killed many who had survived the earthquake. So that which in its time struck Voltaire and many of the illustrated minds struck Goethe as well, although he was only 6. In his biography, which I think the title is Poetry and Truth, I don't know how it's translated into English, but in his autobiography, he states that that was the first time he questioned the existence of a benevolent God. How can God permit such a horrendous catastrophe to happen? That, compounded with his Hebrew studies, when he realizes that the Bible text lends itself to various interpretations, that shaked his faith in Christianity. And we'll come to his religious belief eventually. But now let me just read you a quick quote from his autobiography so you can understand pretty much how he envisioned his own childhood. And then I'll move on to his studies of law in Leipzig. Yes, his autobiography, here I have it. I had from childhood the singular habit of always learning by heart the beginning of books and the divisions of a work, first of the 5 books of Moses, and then of the Aeneid and of its metamorphoses. If an ever busy imagination, of which that tale may bear witness, led me hither and thither, if they medley of fable and history and mythology and religion, and that threatened to bewilder me, I readily fled to those oriental regions, plunged into the first book of Moses, and there, amid the scattered shepherd tribes, found myself at once in the greatest solitude and the greatest society. From his autobiography. He was 16. He was 16 when he started studying law at Leipzig. This took place in 1765. By the way, it didn't go well. He had to return after 2 years, infected with tuberculosis, which at the time was an incurable disease. He recovered, but that's something exceptional. I already mentioned how he also ended derided and mocked by the people in Leipzig, and he also came back brokenhearted with his horrible relationship with Schönköpf, which was impossible from the outset. And by the way, also Goethe ruined it because he felt inferior. So that made him overbearing and jealous. So he destroyed his own relationship. So you can imagine these 2 years where he dedicated himself to studying law were not so happy years, but they were kind of realization for him. Maybe it's the first time that bubble of his childhood burst, and he came to a realization of the reality of life. So he had to return to Frankfurt, infected with tuberculosis, with incomplete studies, brokenhearted. And in this stay in Frankfurt, he had some leisure time, which he dedicated to reading Shakespeare. And that is what he calls his awakening. Of course, he was well-read even before that, but it was then when he discovered his passion for literature, thanks to Shakespeare. Additionally, you've heard that his faith in Christianity was already shaken, but in his stay in Frankfurt, I don't remember the name of this lady, because it's important only in as much as she led. I think her name is Susanna. Susanna von something. I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, but it's not important. It will not come in the exam. This lady led Goethe into Pietism. Pietism is, let's call it, a refined form of Lutheranism that exasperates the rejection toward any human mediation. You know that from the times of Martin Luther, he opened the door to personal interpretation detached from magisterium. Well, but at least he had ministers, right? So there was some kind of some form of human mediation in traditional Lutheranism. Pietism took it to a radical extreme. And you are nodding because you see how all these things will converge into shaping Goethe's mindset. Additionally, Pietism was in quest of some kind of mystical experience. So they dedicated themselves to an intense introspection. On the one hand, becoming aware of one's sins, but also becoming aware of one's interior motions. And that introspection and that self-analysis broadened Goethe's lexicon, to put it like this, because they had a very wide vocabulary for describing emotions and the motions of one's soul. Again, you can see how all this converges into shaping Goethe for whom he would become, right? You see it. He did not become a strict and observant pietist. He did receive a strong influence from that, but he also received a strong influence from another movement that was called Hermetism. And that was some kind of pantheistic philosophy where God is all and all is God. And we are all united in the one, and nature is part of us. And you see those quotes or those references in the source of young Werther. So when he speaks about God, it's a stretch, or you would be too naive to consider Goethe is speaking about God as he is understood in Christianity. That is why he says that the entirety of nature resembles God, and my soul is a reflection of nature. So all those things come together in this kind of pantheistic setting, and Goethe would end up creating his own religion. He created his own religion, to which he remained faithful until death. After this period in Frankfurt, he completed his studies, he recovered from his tuberculosis, and he wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther. I think he was 24. That is one of the reasons why I put it like a great work for you to read, because I think this can resonate. You're in your 20s, most of you, all of you. Anyway, you are not that far away from Goethe's age when he wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther. It is very autobiographical, and we'll delve into it. But even if it didn't give him a great financial gain, because copyright and authors were practically non-existent, that didn't matter. That didn't matter, because that novel became the bestseller and the first bestseller of all times. It was widely read. And just so you know this interesting fact, he didn't publish it as a novel, but he published it part by part in a magazine. So people were expecting for what happens next. And when the new publication came, they read voraciously what was happening. And when it comes to the end, when Werther commits suicide, there is one of the greatest mass suicides recorded in history. Yes, a lot of people committed suicide after that. We'll talk more about Werther in our next session. But that gave him fame from his early 20s to the point that the emperor himself summoned him and wanted him to be part of his court, and he gave him as much as he needed, not only financially but in any other kind of resources. He was admired as a celebrity, and not only in literature. He also dedicated himself to projects of urbanization and delineating how cities should be, and his opinion was taken for way more than an opinion, because he was very influential, not only in literature. He was also very influential in science, and Newtonian science had encountered in Goethe a leading proponent. Some have said, well, we shouldn't pay much attention to his scientific works because, above all, he was a man of literature, but that doesn't mean that his scientific accomplishments or his scientific writings or his scientific observations were to be disregarded. So when I mentioned the 148 volumes of his collected works, there's also a wide range of scientific works. For example, he also delves into optics. There are many essays he also wrote on literary criticism. Just so you get an idea of how devoted he was to his research. When he died, he had the greatest stone collection in all of Europe. How many stones did that collection comprehend? Any guesses?
2,000.
2,000, way more. 17,000. 17,000 stones, all of them categorized and labeled. It's not like just like piling up stones, but he collected 17,000 stones. After he published The Sorrows of Young Werther, he moved to Weimar, where he lived for the rest of his life, with the exception of a short trip to Italy, which took place not so short, because it took place from 1786 to 1788. A 2-year trip to Italy, which he writes about in his memoirs. However, he wrote his memoirs about the trip to Italy like 30 years after he had actually gone to Italy. But it's important. What happened after he returned from Italy? Look at the dates. French Revolution broke out. The French Revolution, and at first he was optimistic about it, and he welcomed it like the entronization of those values that had been presented during the Enlightenment. However, eventually he became very different of it, especially because he didn't trust the masses would be able to rule themselves. What happened after the French Revolution? The terror, and then we cannot understand Napoleon without the French Revolution. Is he going back to illustrated despotism? To some extent, but you would never have Napoleon becoming who he was had it not been thanks to the French Revolution. And Napoleon invaded Weimar when Goethe was living there. His very house was taken by French soldiers. So you can imagine what his opinion was about the Napoleonic invasion. Maybe he was, to some extent, an admirer of Napoleon, but I think he also, that optimism also faded. That same year, 1806, he finally married Christiane Vulpius after living a scandalous relationship with her for 18 years. So, for social convention, he married her. And toward the end of his life, he finished his other great work along with The Source of Young Werther, which is Dr. Faust. Dr. Faust, he began writing it even before The Source of Young Werther. He began writing it when he was a teenager. His grandmother had given him a small theater for puppets. And some say that that was his inspiration to become a playwright. Of course, compounded with Shakespeare and his literature studies and many other things, but that was the initial seed that triggered this passion for theater. However, he didn't have it published until practically the end of his life, which means he kept refining and polishing he kept refining and polishing Dr. Faust until the end of his life. And he died of heart failure in 1832. I think it was the 22nd of March. Yes, 22nd of March. Okay, so that's the life of Goethe. That's the life of Goethe. I think I spoke not enough because there are 148 volumes to explore. So I definitely didn't say everything about his life, and there are many other details here scattered here and there. But I think you get a general overview of Goethe, his life, and his context. Next class we will speak about The Source of Young Werther. Okay? Good. Yes.
When did he die? What year?
It was the 22nd of March of 1832. 1832. Okay? 22nd of March of 1832. Yes.
So he married I didn't get her name, but he married her the same year as Napoleon invades.
Yes.
1806.
Yes. Yes. I imagine the French army, they were leaving Weimar, and there was a wedding. Yes. Of course, that was not his first or his only love. I've already spoken about Schenkopf, and there were several other girls which he abandoned in his life. Mm-hmm. But he maintained an 18-year relationship with Christiane, like Christian but with an A at the end, Christiane Vulpius, which he finally formalized, attaching to social convention in the same year of the Napoleonic invasion.